Memory Lane. Hello, dear viewers. At the end of 1975, just as Vietnam had concluded a devastating war against the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the American imperialists, another war was already looming. In that same year, 1975, tensions between the Soviet Union and China had reached a military confrontation. As a result, Vietnam and China's relations escalated into serious conflict. China began to view Vietnam as an ungrateful, defiant little brother, too closely aligned with the Soviet Union, a traitor that had to be punished. Tragically, this also coincided with the rise of the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia. Backed by Beijing both militarily and economically, the Khmer Rouge launched attacks on Vietnam's southwestern border. On December 25, 1978, Vietnam intervened to suppress the Khmer Rouge. Only a few months later, on February 17, 1979, China launched a massive assault on northern Vietnam, punishing Vietnam for daring to strike its client state. This marked the beginning of a brutal and punishing campaign. The war extended beyond the battlefield. China halted all aid to Vietnam and branded the country as an invader at the United Nations. This opened the door to international sanctions and left Vietnam facing a devastating aftermath with very few allies. The nation was plunged into economic ruin and geopolitical isolation. Never before had Vietnam stood on such precarious ground. But why did China hold such a grudge against Vietnam? What did Vietnam do to turn from a comrade in arms to a sworn enemy? To understand this, we must return to the 1960s. At that time, deep rifts had emerged in the communist bloc, led by the Soviet Union. China continuously criticized the Soviets on both ideological and practical fronts, hoping to chart its own course and even proposing that it take over leadership of the socialist camp. Of course, the Soviets refused. Vietnam was caught in the middle. Both the Soviet Union and China provided weapons and aid to support its war of liberation. China, in particular, not only supplied weapons but also helped transport Soviet arms to Vietnam and pledged post-war reconstruction assistance. China assumed that its neighbor would remain loyal, especially given their geographic proximity. Beijing expected gratitude and allegiance. However, in 1965, as Vietnam intensified its war against the United States and desperately needed support from its socialist allies, the Sino-Soviet split erupted in full force. China and the USSR even mobilized troops to their shared border, each branding the other a threat. Beijing soon drew closer to the United States to counterbalance Soviet power. In July 1971, U.S. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger made a secret visit to Beijing, laying the groundwork for President Richard Nixon's official visit the following year. The U.S. and China began normalizing relations, signing official agreements and improving diplomatic ties at Vietnam's expense. After Nixon's visit, China changed its tone on Vietnam's war. It advised Vietnam to maintain a limited guerrilla campaign to contain U.S. aggression, not a full-scale assault. But Vietnam had other ideas. It pressed forward with total war to reunify the country. On January 27, 1973, the U.S. was forced to sign the Paris Peace Accords and withdraw all troops from South Vietnam. Vietnam's tenacious military campaign embarrassed China, exposing Hanoi's refusal to bow to Beijing's direction. Vietnam had proven that it would not be a puppet state. By 1975, tensions between Vietnam and China had become impossible to ignore. Beijing realized that the new Socialist Republic of Vietnam would not blindly obey its northern neighbor. The idea of Vietnam joining the Soviet orbit terrified China, which now feared a two-front threat, the USSR to the north and Vietnam to the south. On September 18, 1975, China publicly began its campaign against Vietnam. As General Secretary Lê Duan made an official state visit to Beijing, China's People's Daily published a series of large articles about Chinese military units illegally occupying the Paracel Islands, Huangsa. This was a direct provocation. On November 26, 1975, just after Vietnam's delegation returned from a goodwill visit to the Soviet Union, another Chinese paper, the Guangming Daily, again published inflammatory content about the Paracel and Spratly Islands, declaring that all islands must return to Chinese control. These provocations signaled that China now saw Vietnam as an adversary. Vietnam did not back down. In early 1976, General Secretary Le Duan addressed the 25th Central Committee of the Communist Party of Vietnam, stating, "Our victory was thanks to the great support from the Soviet Union, Korea, Cuba, and other socialist allies. Without their help, we could not have prevailed. We must always remember and honor their contributions. We must teach our children and grandchildren to always be grateful." But even these words would not prevent what was coming. The path to war was already laid. But we must remain independent and self-reliant, because in international relations, each country has its own position based on differing interests and geography. Even close allies cannot always agree on matters important to one nation. After this speech was publicly released, major newspapers in Beijing immediately published a series of articles attacking Vietnam. They portrayed us as ungrateful to China, arrogant, and a puppet of the Soviet Union. At this point, China's hostility toward Vietnam became blatant. In their eyes, we were a small, impoverished nation asking for aid yet refusing to obey. From the perspective of a major power seeking to lead the communist bloc, China viewed our actions as insolent. This was the context that ignited the Sino-Vietnamese border conflict, beginning in late 1975 and early 1976. Simultaneously, the Khmer Rouge regime under Pol Pot rose to power in Cambodia. After taking control of the military, Pol Pot openly provoked neighboring Vietnam. Cambodia turned to China for support, and China eagerly agreed. Hatred toward Vietnam and submissiveness to China transformed Cambodia into Beijing's key Southeast Asian ally. China sought not only to suppress Vietnam's regional strength, but to use Cambodia as a proxy to exact revenge. China began supplying weapons to Cambodia at an alarming rate. In July 1977, Cambodia had only 6 divisions, but by January 1978, they had 25. With just 6 months of Chinese military aid, the Cambodian army was revived like a demon rising from the ashes of war. Estimates indicate that from 1975 to the end of 1978, China supplied Cambodia with cannons, mortars, machine guns, transport vehicles, and fuel, enough for an army of 200,000 troops. Additionally, 10,000 Chinese advisors and military experts were sent to train Pol Pot's army. This marked the beginning of a prolonged conflict between Cambodia and Vietnam. In late 1977, documents from China's Guangzhou military region emphasized preparations to attack Vietnam. Propaganda depicted Vietnam as a Soviet puppet with ambitions to invade Cambodia, Laos, and dominate Southeast Asia. Articles called for decisive action against Vietnam, branding it a regional aggressor. In May 1978, China announced a partial cut in aid to Vietnam, citing the need to support repatriated overseas Chinese. Chinese engineers and experts were recalled. By June 17, 1978, China demanded Vietnamese consulates in Kunming, Guangzhou, and Nanning be closed. By July 1978, all aid and Chinese experts in Vietnam were withdrawn. At the same time, Pol Pot launched fierce attacks on Vietnam. The Khmer Rouge repeatedly invaded Vietnam's southwestern territories, massacring tens of thousands in an attempt to divide the nation. Vietnam could no longer avoid a full-scale war. On December 25, 1978, Vietnam deployed troops to suppress the Khmer Rouge. China responded with a stern warning, vowing to teach Vietnam a lesson. The Soviet Union immediately boosted military aid to Vietnam, sending aircraft, anti-aircraft weapons, tanks, ammunition, and war supplies by air. Dear viewers, the causes of the 1979 Sino-Vietnamese War were not solely China's fear of Vietnam aligning with the Soviet bloc. Deep-rooted conflicts over the ethnic Chinese population, Hoa, also played a major role. Before Vietnam's liberation in 1975, many ethnic Chinese had migrated from China to southern Vietnam. They came during feudal times and increased steadily over the years. The Hoa community formed villages separate from Vietnamese society, preserved Chinese culture, and established Chinese language schools. Chinese signs dominated the streets. There was once hope that this cultural presence would flourish peacefully in Vietnam. Since the Communist Party of Vietnam took power, the story began on April 30th, 1975. The day liberation forces entered Saigon, raised their flag atop the Independence Palace, and officially dissolved the puppet regime of South Vietnam. Crowds flooded the streets in jubilation, celebrating the long-awaited unification of the country. Among them were Chinese Vietnamese residents of Cho Lan, who warmly welcomed the soldiers. However, there was a bitter irony. In their hands were not Vietnamese flags, but the flag of the People's Republic of China and portraits of Mao Zedong. This act marked the beginning of a wave of Chinese expulsions. Soon after, the Communist Party implemented a series of harsh policies, forcing ethnic Chinese to adopt Vietnamese citizenship, shutting down Chinese language schools, removing Chinese signage, and enforcing cultural assimilation. Those who dared to protest were immediately deported to China. The government's tightening grip became so suffocating that within a short time, almost no one of Chinese nationality remained on Vietnamese soil. Today we look back at history to understand what really happened. Historically, Hoa Q referred to the respected Chinese diaspora, but after the South was unified under the communist regime, that term took on a darker connotation, becoming Nan Q, meaning a calamity to be purged. These ethnic Chinese who lived abroad but retained their Chinese citizenship had settled in Vietnam for centuries, some since the Northern Domination period. In the 17th century, the collapse of the Southern Ming dynasty in China led loyalists to flee to neighboring countries, including Vietnam. While the Vietnamese monarchy welcomed the migration, rulers never truly trusted the loyalty of these settlers. Nonetheless, from the later Lei period onward, the Hoa Q were granted many privileges, including the right to live and trade freely on Vietnamese land without needing to renounce their Chinese nationality. They often lived in isolated communities, separate from native Vietnamese, and over generations built wealth and influence. Under French colonial rule and even during the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam, the Chinese community flourished and came to dominate the southern economy. This prosperity was aided in part by French policy. In the 19th century, the French allowed Chinese settlers to reside in Saigon and Cho Lan. Before 1945, the French granted them monopolies over key goods such as rice, salt, and alcohol. Notably, they openly permitted and encouraged the trade of opium, assigning distribution rights to the Chinese community. This allowed them to amass significant profits and political clout in southern Vietnam. But that was before 1975. After liberation, things changed drastically. From 1975 onward, tensions between Hanoi and Beijing reached a boiling point. So when the Chinese Vietnamese in Cho Lan waved the Chinese flag and displayed Mao Zedong's portrait to greet the new government, it only fueled the Communist Party's suspicions. Their display of ethnic loyalty to China during a time of strained relations triggered deep mistrust. And so, once the government had consolidated control over the South, the clampdown began. In January 1976, to probe the depth of the issue, the Vietnamese government ordered the ethnic Chinese in the South to register their nationality, either fully naturalize as Vietnamese citizens or retain Chinese nationality. As a result, the majority at that time chose to register as Chinese nationals. From this point on, Hanoi began to view the Chinese community not as a mere domestic issue, but as a matter of national sovereignty. At that time, the most pressing question in Hanoi was, why did these ethnic Chinese, who had lived in Vietnam for generations, still refuse to take Vietnamese citizenship? It's important to note that the Chinese had been migrating to Vietnam since before the later Lei dynasty. They had children, established roots, and thrived from the Trinh Nguyen Civil War through to the French colonial period. Even after the new government took power in the South, they still chose to stay. yet they refused to naturalize. This strange behavior alarmed Hanoi, who feared that the Chinese community in Vietnam could be a ticking time bomb planted by Beijing. Evidence for this was clear. In the South, the Chinese business community controlled much of the economy. Chinese entrepreneurs dominated wholesale and import-export sectors, forming a powerful and isolated economic elite. A Communist Party publication analyzed the situation in August 1978. The bourgeoisie of Chinese descent has taken control of nearly all key economic positions, especially the three critical sectors: processing, distribution, and credit. By the end of 1974, they controlled over 80% of food production, textiles, chemicals, metals, construction, and electricity industries. They monopolized 100% of wholesale trade, more than 50% of retail, and 90% of import-export. They completely controlled rice and grain purchases. Because they controlled the goods supply to the market, they could manipulate prices through their monopoly on imports, transportation, and distribution networks. They built a self-contained world with their own factions, each led by a head figure to avoid local government interference. Each group had its own budget, schools, hospitals, newspapers, headquarters, and cemeteries, a nation within a nation. Hanoi's suspicions were not baseless. In 1961-1962, the Chinese Communist Party orchestrated a labor strike in Mongolia to pressure the Soviet Union. They had also implemented similar tactics in northern Vietnam. Clearly, many overseas Chinese maintained ties with their motherland, turning them into potential pawns for the Chinese Communist Party. The reason many ethnic Chinese refused to naturalize wasn't only fear of losing their identity. They had been given special privileges, doing business freely, maintaining cultural identity, and building their own mini-nation within another. Through loyalty to mainland China, they could influence Vietnam's economy and politics. To Vietnam, this Chinese community resembled a parasitic force draining the country. That's why they were referred to as the Hoa Nan, the Chinese plague, implying they were a national disaster, a looming threat. If these individuals were not expelled, China could easily incite unrest from within. The consequences were clear by 1977, 2 years after reunification. Vietnam faced spiraling inflation, food shortages, and unchecked hoarding, further confirming Hanoi's fears that Chinese capitalists in the South were destabilizing the country economically and politically. Coupled with a deteriorating economy and the brewing conflict with Cambodia, Vietnam's leadership feared a collapse from both within and without, orchestrated by Beijing. As a result, on February 5, 1978, the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Vietnam convened its fourth session and passed 2 strategic decisions. 1. Seek to overthrow Pol Pot in Cambodia. 2. Crush the Chinese-backed economic groups operating in the South. In April 1978, the Vietnamese government announced the implementation of reforms targeting the private capitalist trade and industry sector in the South. While it was labeled as reform, in reality, these were harsh policies aimed at suppressing the ethnic Chinese Choa community. Among these policies was the nationalization of assets from nearly 30,000 private businesses and the issuance of a new unified national currency to replace both northern and southern banknotes, tightening state control over the economy. Furthermore, Communist Party members and high-ranking officials of Chinese descent working in administrative, technical, and industrial sectors were simultaneously stripped of their authority. Several technical projects were forcibly handed over or required to transfer their expertise to Vietnamese workers. Ethnic Chinese were subjected to bureaucratic obstacles in nearly every aspect of daily life. Even routine procedures became difficult. These suffocating measures triggered a mass exodus of Chinese residents from Vietnam in 1978, returning to China en masse. Along with this wave of migration, huge amounts of gold, property, homes, and businesses were seized and nationalized by the Vietnamese authorities. Not long after, almost no Chinese nationals remained in Vietnam. Helplessly watching their people being expelled, The Chinese government immediately accused Vietnam of persecution, mistreatment, and forced deportation of the Hoa. This became one of the key factors fueling post-1975 tensions between Vietnam and China. Then came the revenge plan. On April 30, 1978, the director of the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office in China made a public statement expressing concern over the mass return of Hoa people from Vietnam, promising to properly resettle them. With veiled intent, China began turning the spotlight of public opinion, both domestically and internationally, toward the plight of the Hoa. They painted Vietnam as cruel and unjust toward the Chinese community, accusing the Vietnamese government of harboring extremist anti-Chinese sentiment. China began establishing reception centers along its border and publicly announced plans to send ships to Vietnam to rescue its citizens from brutal treatment. This was the beginning of a carefully orchestrated international campaign, and so China accused Vietnam of bowing to oppression while manipulating global opinion. At home and abroad, few doubted China's narrative. By the time Chinese Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping declared that Vietnam must be taught a lesson, the world believed this would merely be a self-defense counterattack, a reaction to a radical Vietnam oppressing the ethnic Chinese. The Chinese Communist Party had achieved two goals. It retaliated and simultaneously boosted its domestic credibility. We returned their people to their homeland. They sent troops into ours. And the massacre of civilians at the border in 1979 left an indelible scar on the relationship between our two countries. Greetings to our viewers. After Vietnam reunified the South in 1975, by 1976, tensions with China had rapidly escalated. Vietnam became wary that Beijing might use the Hoa people, ethnic Chinese in Vietnam, as leverage to pressure us into adopting its political line. From then on, the Hoa issue was no longer seen as a mere internal matter. It became a question of national sovereignty. The one nationality policy was implemented. Those who refused to take Vietnamese citizenship were dismissed from jobs, barred from business, and Chinese language schools were shut down. Due to these restrictions, by 1978 there was a mass exodus of Hoa people back to China. Since 1977, around 70,000 Hoa had returned. By the time the border war broke out, approximately 160,000 had fled, by sea or overland via the Hunungi border gate. The Hoa issue became the spark for a full-blown border war. Historians note that from China's perspective, Hanoi had become a traitorous and ungrateful regime. Despite China's assistance in the war against the U.S., Vietnam had allegedly mistreated the Hoa and warmed relations with the Soviet Union, China's rival at the time. Even worse, Vietnam had overthrown the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia, Beijing's close ally. All these actions were perceived as direct challenges to Chinese influence in Indochina. Determined not to lose face, China resolved to teach Vietnam a lesson. However, they couldn't publicly admit their motives. Instead, they painted Vietnam as aggressive and warlike, justifying their military buildup as a countermeasure. According to the memoirs of Zhou Deli, Chief of Staff of the Guangzhou Military Region, in September 1978, as tens of thousands of Hoa fled to China, the General Staff of the People's Liberation Army held a meeting on the Vietnam border issue. At first, the goal was limited: a small strike against a Vietnamese regiment in Trung Can, Chao Bang, near Guangxi. But when intelligence suggested Vietnam planned to invade Cambodia, the tone changed. Many attendees pushed for a larger-scale strike, one that would truly pressure Hanoi and alter the strategic dynamics in Southeast Asia. The plan was to strike a regular Vietnamese army unit in a broad geographic area. Still, the meeting ended without a concrete decision. Then, on November 5, 1978, Deng Xiaoping began a diplomatic tour of Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore. During this trip, he declared that Vietnam's signing of the Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation with the Soviet Union on November 3, 1978, posed a direct threat to ASEAN nations. Deng called for the formation of a coalition to counter both the Soviet Union and Vietnam, one that would include China and ASEAN countries. He clearly articulated China's intent to prevent Southeast Asia from falling under Vietnamese and Soviet dominance. He even publicly stated that China would use military force if Vietnam attacked Cambodia. China had covert support from several countries at the time, especially Thailand. At the request of Deng Xiaoping, Thailand agreed to allow Chinese aircraft to transit through Thai airspace to Cambodia and back. This formed an alliance between Beijing and Bangkok, opening a supply route that allowed Deng Xiaoping to traverse Thailand and turn it into a strategic buffer zone for China and Cambodia. In reality, while the Cambodia issue had not yet directly affected the security of ASEAN nations, most member states were concerned about Vietnam expanding its hegemony in Indochina. They wanted to curb Vietnam's growing power, but didn't wish to be directly involved, so they remained silent, quietly supporting China's war efforts. After gaining regional support, on December 7, 1978, the Central Military Commission of the People's Republic of China convened and decided to launch a limited war along the Vietnam-China border. The operation was to be restricted to 50 kilometers from the border and last for only 2 weeks. On December 8, 1978, the Central Military Commission ordered the Guangzhou and Kunming military regions to fully prepare their forces before January 10, 1979, to implement the invasion. Also in December 1978, during a tour of Southeast Asia, and in a televised interview, Deng Xiaoping publicly declared Vietnam to be a bully and said it needed to be taught a lesson. Beijing framed the invasion as a counterattack in response to Vietnam's provocations. Xinhua news agency's spokesperson claimed Chinese border forces were forced to act when the situation became intolerable. We have no desire to claim a single inch of Vietnamese territory. What we want is a stable and peaceful border. Once we have repelled the warmongers appropriately, our border forces will return to firmly defend our homeland. In short, before fully mobilizing its vast military against Vietnam, China had meticulously prepared, gauging the Soviet Union's intentions, courting support from the United States and ASEAN, shaping international opinion to paint Vietnam as aggressive and China as peace-loving. This set the stage for a smooth launch of China's punitive campaign against Vietnam. According to Vietnamese analysis, China's main military objectives were: 1. Quickly occupy the border region, especially key towns like Lang Son, cutting Highway 1 between Vietnam and China, Cao Bang and Lao Cai, with a planned depth of several dozen kilometers. 2. Neutralize Vietnamese main forces and weaken border defense capabilities, including the complete destruction of border outposts, local militias, and independent military units. This would create a buffer zone separating the two countries, enabling China to station troops long-term and, if needed, penetrate deeper into Vietnamese territory. 3. Severely damage infrastructure and the economy in occupied regions to cripple Vietnam's national economy. At the beginning of 1979, China mobilized a substantial military force in preparation for its invasion of Vietnam. Estimates suggest that the People's Liberation Army, PLA, had approximately 4.5 million personnel, with around 250,000 troops concentrated along the Sino-Vietnamese border. The PLA's ground forces were organized into 121 infantry divisions, 11 armored divisions, and 40 artillery divisions. The Air Force comprised 3 divisions, totaling about 5,000 combat aircraft, while the Navy included approximately 300,000 personnel and 200 warships. Endupress.ndu.edu. China's military strategy involved deploying forces from the Guangxi and Yunnan military regions, including 9 Army Corps and several independent infantry divisions, totaling 32 divisions. These units were supported by 6 tank regiments, 4 artillery divisions, and multiple anti-aircraft regiments. The PLA also mobilized over 600,000 troops, 550 tanks, 480 artillery pieces, and 1,260 mortars. Additionally, the Southern Fleet's naval forces and approximately 948 aircraft were placed on alert, including 706 fighters, J-5, J-6, J-7, 120 fighter bombers, J-6, Q-5, and 122 bombers, H-5, H-6. To support the invasion, China assembled a significant logistical network. In the Guangxi region alone, approximately 215,000 civilian laborers were mobilized to assist with transportation, supply distribution, and medical evacuation. The PLA's operational plan emphasized overwhelming firepower and rapid penetration into Vietnamese territory. Artillery units were tasked with intense bombardments to disrupt enemy defenses, followed by swift infantry assaults aimed at key strategic locations. The Chinese command structure for the invasion included General Xu Xiu overseeing operations in the Eastern Front, Guangxi, and General Yang Deji commanding the Western Front, Yunnan. The PLA's tactics focused on concentrating attacks on critical points rather than engaging the strongest enemy positions directly. This approach aimed to exploit weaknesses in Vietnamese defenses and achieve rapid territorial gains. Despite the massive mobilization and initial advances, the conflict resulted in significant casualties on both sides and highlighted the challenges of conducting large-scale military operations in difficult terrain against a well-prepared adversary. But the celebration slowly came to an end after the Communist Party of Vietnam took power. The story begins on April 30th, 1975. The day Liberation Army forces entered Saigon, raised their flag atop the Independence Palace, and officially erased the regime of the South Vietnamese government. Crowds flooded the streets in jubilation, celebrating the long-awaited reunification of the country. Among them, the Chinese Vietnamese community in Cho Lan, Saigon's Chinatown, also welcomed the victory. But ironically, in their hands, many waved the flag of China and carried portraits of Mao Zedong. That symbolic gesture would soon mark the beginning of a forced expulsion. Not long afterward, the Vietnamese Communist government implemented a wave of harsh policies aimed at the ethnic Chinese. They were forced to give up their Chinese citizenship. Chinese language schools were shut down. Chinese signage was removed, and various assimilation measures were enacted. Those who dared protest were promptly deported to China. The government's tightening grip made it so unbearable that soon, virtually no ethnic Chinese holding Chinese nationality remained in Vietnam. But why did the Vietnamese government act so strongly against the Hoa people, Chinese Vietnamese? And how did the Hoa crisis become a root cause of the border war? Today, we'll trace back through history to understand what happened. Back in the feudal era, the term Hoa Kieu, overseas Chinese, referred to a respected group of Chinese migrants. But after Vietnam's reunification under the communist regime, they were increasingly referred to as a crisis, a threat that needed elimination. Hoa Kieu were people of Chinese descent living abroad while retaining Chinese citizenship. Many had settled in Vietnam long ago, even as far back as the Northern Domination period. A major influx occurred in the 17th century, when the fall of the Southern Ming dynasty led loyalists to flee the Manchu Qing rulers. Some came to neighboring countries, including Vietnam. Although Vietnamese monarchs had long opened their borders to Chinese immigrants, they never fully trusted their loyalty. Still, beginning in the later Lei dynasty, the Hoa community received special privileges, including the right to live and trade freely in Vietnamese territory without needing to naturalize. Over time, these communities grew, living apart from native Vietnamese. They had children, built wealth, and flourished, from the Nguyen dynasty to the French colonial period, and even under the South Vietnamese Republic. By then, the Chinese had virtually taken control of the southern Vietnamese economy. Their affluence was partly due to colonial favoritism. In the 19th century, the French encouraged the Chinese to settle in Saigon Cho Lan and granted them monopolies over key goods like rice, salt, and alcohol, especially opium. The French government openly sold opium and encouraged its use among Vietnamese, later outsourcing its distribution to the Chinese community. This brought massive profits and elevated the Hoa to a powerful economic bloc in southern Vietnam. But that was before 1975. After reunification, From 1975 onward, relations between Hanoi and Beijing grew increasingly strained. So, when the Hoa community in Cholon greeted the victorious forces waving Chinese flags and Mao's portrait, it deepened suspicions among the Vietnamese communist leadership. They saw the gesture as a troubling sign of misplaced national loyalty. Thus, once power was consolidated in the South, the new government began to act. As the smoke cleared over the rugged hills of Zhongzhong, silence returned. Not peace, but a heavy, watchful silence. The scars of the battle remained etched in the landscape and in the hearts of those who survived. Though the fighting subsided, the questions lingered. Was this the final act of punishment, or merely a warning of things to come? And for a people caught between giants, could there ever truly be rest? Only time would tell, as the mountains remembered and the border held its breath.